Welcome back, Heartland fans, to Heartland Flavors. In our last episode, we left Amy and Ty on that ridge with a painful, uncertain truth hanging between them. Now, in this direct continuation, their fragile new beginning faces its ultimate test as Ty comes face to face with Nathan. In the days following their ride to the ridge, a new and fragile understanding settled over Heartland. The raw honesty of their conversation had bulldozed the walls of pretense, leaving them exposed, but on common ground. The silence between Amy and Ty was no longer a weapon, but a shared space for contemplation. They spoke, but their words were carefully chosen, navigating the safe, shallow waters of daily life. The health of a particular horse, Lindy's latest drawing, the looming threat of a storm on the horizon. They were like two strangers who had agreed to build a bridge, but were still standing on opposite banks, unsure of how to lay the first plank. Ty was trying. Amy could see it in the small, deliberate ways he moved through his days. He mucked out stalls without being asked, he listened more than he spoke, and he watched her with an intensity that was a mixture of love, loss, and a deep, gnawing uncertainty. The words she had spoken on that ridge echoed constantly in his mind. I learned how to not need anyone. He felt like a man on probation in his own life, every action a test, every word weighed and measured. The desperation to prove himself was still there, a hot coal in his gut, but it was now tempered by the terrifying knowledge that one more reckless act could shatter the fragile peace entirely. The outside world, however, could not be held at bay forever. A vital piece of equipment for the clinic, a specialized centrifuge needed for blood work, had broken down. It was a part that couldn't be ordered online and required a trip to the veterinary supply depot in Hudson. Amy hesitated, the suggestion hanging in the air. A trip to town? It was such a normal, mundane thing, yet the thought of it sent a ripple of anxiety through her. Town meant eyes. It meant whispers, and most of all, it meant the possibility of a chance encounter she was not yet ready to navigate. She opened her mouth to say she could handle it alone, the words of independence already formed on her lips. But she stopped. She looked at Ty, who was standing by the window, staring out at the ranch that was both his home and his prison. She couldn't keep him sheltered forever. It wasn't fair. As if reading her mind, he turned to her, his expression resolute.
We should go together.
It wasn't a question.
I can't hide out here forever, Amy. I have to start somewhere.
An hour later, they were pulling into Hudson. Ty drove, his knuckles white on the steering wheel, his gaze fixed forward. Every familiar storefront, every passing face seemed to magnify his sense of alienation. He was a ghost haunting the streets of his own town. After a tense, mostly silent trip to the supply depot, Amy, sensing his frayed nerves, made a suggestion.
Let's get a coffee before we head back.
She gestured towards Maggie's diner, the heart of their small town. It was an attempt at normalcy, a hand reaching across the divide. Ty gave a curt nod, grateful for the offer, but dreading the reality of it. The moment they pushed through the door, a hush fell over the diner. The cheerful clatter of cutlery and the low hum of conversation faltered as every eye turned towards them. Whispers erupted like brush fires in their wake. Ty could feel the stares on his back, a combination of pity, shock, and morbid curiosity. He felt less like a man and more like a myth that had just walked into the room. He followed Amy to a booth in the corner, his shoulders rigid, his jaw clenched so tightly it ached. Amy tried to ignore the attention, focusing on the menu with an intensity it didn't deserve. She could feel Ty's coiled tension beside her, a vibrating wire of anxiety. Lou, busy behind the counter, gave them a brief, sympathetic smile before turning back to her work. It was in that moment that Ty's gaze began to drift across the room. He scanned the faces, a sea of familiar townspeople, until his eyes landed on a man sitting at the counter, laughing at something Lou had just said. He was handsome, in a clean-cut, unassuming way, with a calm confidence that seemed to radiate from him. He looked strong, steady, and completely at ease. He looked like everything Ty was not. It was Nathan. Time seemed to slow, the background noise of the diner fading into a dull, distant roar. In Ty's mind, this wasn't just a man. This was the placeholder. This was the man who had sat at his kitchen table, who had likely read his daughter bedtime stories, who had stood beside his wife and offered comfort while he was gone. This was the man who had lived a piece of his life. He must have tensed, or perhaps his gaze was so intense it was a physical force, because Amy stopped reading the menu. She looked at his face, then followed his line of sight. Her breath caught in a small, sharp gasp. She saw him. The inevitable had arrived. The air in their small booth crackled, suddenly charged with years of loss, grief, and the impossible complexity of a love that had refused to die, only to be resurrected into a world that had learned to live without it. The world, which had ground to a halt, slowly began to turn again, but the axis had shifted. Nathan, perhaps feeling the weight of their combined stare, turned on his stool at the counter. His easy smile faltered for a fraction of a second as he saw them, a flicker of surprise, and something more complicated. Sympathy, perhaps, crossing his features. He gave a small, almost imperceptible nod of acknowledgement. For Ty, that simple gesture felt like a challenge. This man wasn't just in his town. He was comfortable, established, laughing with Lou at the counter of the diner that was a cornerstone of Ty's own history. He was occupying Ty's space, a living embodiment of the life that had gone on, a life that had found ways to fill the hole he had left behind. A hot, possessive anger, born of pure insecurity, began to churn in Ty's gut. Amy felt the shift in the air, the sudden drop in temperature in their booth. She saw the rigid set of Ty's shoulders and the hard line of his jaw. She knew this moment was a precipice. They could turn and walk out, an act of such blatant avoidance that it would become gossip by supper time. Or they could face it, her sense of decency and a deep, unwilling obligation to the man who had been her friend, won out. She placed a hand lightly on Ty's arm. It was as tense as a drawn bowstring.
Ty.
Her voice was low, pleading.
We should go say hello.
He didn't respond, but he allowed her to lead him. The walk across the diner floor was the longest of his life. Every footstep was a conscious effort. He could feel the burn of dozens of eyes on his back, could hear the whispers die as they passed each table. He was acutely aware of Amy beside him, a buffer between him and the man at the counter. And he hated it. He hated his own weakness, hated that he needed her to navigate this. As they approached, Nathan slid off his stool and stood to face them, his expression one of polite, somber respect. He was taller than Ty had imagined. Amy's voice was strained, unnaturally bright.
Nathan, you know my husband, Ty.
The words were clumsy, inadequate. My husband. A title Ty felt he had no right to, spoken to the man who had come so close to taking it. Nathan extended a hand toward Ty. It was a gesture of peace, of maturity.
Ty, it's incredible. Welcome home.
His voice was steady, sincere. Ty stared at the offered hand for a beat too long before finally taking it. His grip was brief and crushing, a barely concealed act of aggression.
Thanks.
The word was gravel in his throat. Nathan seemed to take no offense, withdrawing his hand smoothly. His gaze was direct and held a surprising depth of empathy.
I was so sorry to hear what happened to you, what you went through. It was a tragedy.
The word tragedy struck a sour note with Ty. It felt like pity. It felt like this man was discussing a chapter of his family's pain that he had no right to even open. Amy, sensing Ty's mounting hostility, jumped in, her words rushing to fill the dangerous silence.
We were just picking up a new centrifuge part for the clinic. The old one finally gave out.
It was meaningless chatter, a desperate attempt to steer the conversation onto the safe, neutral ground of veterinary equipment. Nathan nodded, his attention shifting to Amy for a moment, his expression softening almost imperceptibly.
Is that so? Well, if you need a hand installing it, just let me know.
The offer was kind, professional, but to Ty it sounded like a reminder that Nathan had been the one to help before, a reminder that he was still a part of this world. That was it. Ty could no longer stand in silence. He needed to mark his territory, to reclaim some sliver of his own narrative. He looked from Nathan back to Amy, then settled his cold gaze on Nathan again.
So you're the vet from Fairfield.
It was a simple statement of fact, but his tone gave it the edge of an accusation. Nathan's polite smile didn't waver.
Yeah, that's me.
Right.
Ty said. A beat of silence passed, thick and heavy.
Well, thanks for looking after things while I was gone.
The words were spoken softly, almost casually, but they landed in the space between the three of them with the force of a physical blow. The unspoken meaning was crystal clear. Thanks for moving in on my life. The polite mask on Nathan's face tightened just a fraction at the corners of his eyes. He understood the implication perfectly. Amy's face flushed with a mixture of anger and humiliation. She shot Ty a sharp, warning look, but the damage was done. It was Lou who broke the spell. Seeing the storm brewing from behind the counter, she called out, her voice overly cheerful.
Hey, your coffee's ready at your booth, you two. Didn't want it to get cold?
The interruption was a lifeline. But as they turned away from the counter, the quiet battle had been fought, and the air was now poisoned with the bitter taste of what had been said, and all the things that had not. Nathan gave a final, polite nod, his gaze lingering on Amy for just a moment with an expression of sincere sympathy.
Well, I'll let you two get to your coffee. Amy, good to see you.
And with that, he turned, paid his bill at the counter, and walked out of Maggie's, leaving a vortex of unresolved tension in his wake. Amy stood frozen for a moment, the blood roaring in her ears. She felt the weight of every stare in the diner, felt the heat of Ty's silent, simmering rage beside her. Lou's offer of coffee was a distant echo. The thought of sitting back down in that booth, of trying to pretend that the world hadn't just cracked open beneath their feet, was unbearable. Without a word, she turned and walked towards the exit. Ty, after a second of stunned surprise, followed her out into the harsh daylight of the street. The truck, their shared confined space, felt like a pressure cooker as they climbed inside. Amy started the engine with a sharp, angry twist of the key and pulled out onto the road, her eyes fixed forward, her knuckles white on the steering wheel. The silence was absolute, hostile, and vibrating with things unsaid. It was Ty who broke it, his voice dripping with a sarcasm that couldn't quite mask the deep, wounded tremor beneath.
So that's him.
Amy didn't respond, her gaze locked on the road ahead. Her silence only fueled his anger, an anger born from the profound humiliation he'd felt back in the diner.
The guy who was going to be Lindy's new dad?
He threw the words at her like stones, wanting to hurt her, wanting to provoke a reaction that would validate the storm of jealousy raging inside him.
Looked pretty comfortable. Seemed to know everyone. I guess he fits right in.
He was spiraling, his insecurities pouring out of him disguised as accusations. He wanted a fight. He wanted her to be defensive, to argue, to give him something tangible to push against. He did not get the fight he was looking for. Amy suddenly slammed on the brakes, pulling the truck to a screeching halt on the gravel shoulder of the empty country road. The sudden stop threw them both forward against their seatbelts. She turned to face him, and for the first time since his return, he saw not sorrow, not confusion, but a clear, cold, righteous fury in her eyes. It silenced him instantly.
Don't.
Her voice was low, but it cut through the air with the sharp edge of a blade.
Don't you dare do that.
Do what, Amy? State the obvious?
Ty shot back, his bravado already faltering under her glare.
He was there, Ty.
She said, her voice shaking with a tightly controlled emotion.
That's the only thing that matters. He was there. When I got the phone call that shattered my entire world into a million pieces, eventually, he was there. When Lindy had a fever so high I was terrified to be alone, he drove into town and brought back medicine and groceries, and left them on the porch because he didn't want to intrude. He was a friend. He listened when all I could do was cry about you.
Each word was a precise, painful blow, dismantling Ty's anger piece by piece.
He was kind to my daughter. He was respectful of your memory. He was a good man in an impossible situation, and you were not here.
She leaned in, her eyes blazing with the fire of a survivor defending the scars she had earned.
You do not get to be angry at the person who showed your family kindness while you were gone. You don't get to judge the life I had to build to survive. You just don't.
Her words hung in the suffocating silence of the truck. Ty opened his mouth to argue, to defend his own pain, but no sound came out. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and he didn't see a woman defending another man. He saw a woman fiercely protecting her own hard-won peace. He saw a woman defending her right to have survived. And in that devastating moment, the anger inside him didn't just falter, it collapsed entirely, leaving a cold, cavernous void in its place. The realization hit him with the force of a physical impact. His rage had never been about Nathan. Nathan was just a symbol, a convenient target. The real object of his fury, the true source of this toxic, possessive jealousy, was himself. He was angry at his own powerlessness, angry at his own failure. He hadn't been there to protect his family, not from another man, but from the crushing weight of his own absence. Nathan hadn't tried to take his life. He had simply stepped into the space that Ty's own tragic fate had left empty. The fight was over. Amy, her point made, put the truck back in gear and drove the rest of the way to Heartland in a heavy, ringing silence. Ty stared out the passenger window, the familiar landscape blurring past, unseen. He had walked into Maggie's diner wanting to confront his rival, but he had walked out confronted by something far more terrifying. The truth of his own profound and irreparable failure. And he had no idea what to do with it. And with that crushing realization, the fight drains out of Ty, leaving him with a silence heavier than any anger. What shocking turn of events will follow this confrontation at Heartland? How does a man begin to heal when he finally realizes the fight has been with himself all along? You'll have to follow along for part 3 to see what happens next. If you're hooked on this story, please hit the like button, let me know your predictions in the comments, and be sure to subscribe to Heartland Flavors so you don't miss a moment. Thanks for watching!